I realized something was wrong the day my wife stopped arguing with me. Not because the arguments were good. They weren't. But they meant she still cared enough to push back. When the silence replaced the frustration, that's when I understood the relationship was slipping away. Her name was Elena. We had been married for 3 years, together for 6. I always thought we were stable. No scandals, no betrayals, no dramatic fights. We built a predictable life, steady jobs, shared rent, weekend groceries, occasional dinners with friends. From the outside, we looked fine. Inside, I was slowly losing her. The first real warning came when she asked me a simple question. When was the last time we had a real conversation? I laughed at first, assuming she was exaggerating. I said we talked every day. We discussed bills, schedules, errands. That should count, right? She didn't argue. She just looked tired. I mean something that isn't about logistics, she clarified. I remember feeling slightly irritated. Work had been intense. I was managing a major project with tight deadlines. I came home exhausted most nights. I believed providing stability was my way of loving her. Long hours meant security. Security meant future. That was my logic. Elena didn't share that logic. She worked as a graphic designer and spent evenings on creative projects. Recently, she started staying longer at her studio. At first, I encouraged it. I was proud of her ambition. I told myself we were both focused on growth. But our time together shrank. We ate dinner in silence more often. She stopped telling me small stories about her day. When I tried to initiate intimacy, she would sometimes say she was tired. I didn't question it. I accepted it as normal stress. Looking back, I see how many moments I dismissed. One night, she tried to explain that she felt disconnected. I was replying to emails while she spoke. I remember nodding without fully listening. When she finished, I told her we'd talk about it this weekend. That weekend never came. Weeks passed. Then she asked if I would consider couples counseling. I remember hesitating. I thought therapy was for couples in crisis, not for us. I told her we didn't need outside help. I said communication was something we could fix ourselves. She didn't push the topic again. That silence should have scared me. Instead, I assumed things were stabilizing. I believed absence of conflict meant progress. I didn't realize she had simply stopped trying to convince me. The turning point came on a Thursday evening. I arrived home later than usual. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of her. Not angry, not crying, calm. She said she needed space. My mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. I asked if she was leaving me. She answered carefully that she didn't want to rush into labels, but she couldn't keep feeling emotionally alone in the marriage. That sentence hit harder than any accusation. She explained that she had tried to express her needs multiple times. She had felt unheard. Over time, she began protecting herself by withdrawing. The more I focused on work, the more distant she became. Not out of spite, but self-preservation. I finally understood that we had both contributed to the distance, but in different ways. She packed a suitcase that night. I watched in disbelief as she folded clothes with deliberate calm. There was no dramatic shouting, no breaking objects, just quiet finality. Before leaving, she said something I will never forget. I don't want to fight for attention anymore. Then she walked out. The apartment felt unfamiliar after she left. Every sound seemed louder. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer immediately. When she finally responded, her voice was controlled. She agreed to talk later in the week. During those days alone, I replayed our conversations. I noticed patterns I had ignored. When she shared concerns, I responded with solutions instead of empathy. When she expressed loneliness, I defended my intentions instead of acknowledging her feelings. I thought love was proven through sacrifice at work. I didn't realize love also requires presence at home. By the time we met again, I had started therapy, not to win her back, but to understand my behavior. I told her about that decision when we sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. I admitted I had prioritized career growth over emotional connection. I didn't promise perfection. I promised consistent effort. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she appreciated the changes, but trust doesn't rebuild instantly. She needed time to decide whether reconciliation was possible. For the first time, I felt the weight of consequences rather than excuses. I realized I had tried to fix everything only after it was already breaking, and I wasn't sure if repairing it now would be enough. When she agreed to meet me again for a counseling session, I understood it wasn't a victory. It was an opportunity. That difference mattered. Elena arrived early. I could tell because she was already seated when I walked into the waiting room. She looked composed, but not distant. There was caution in her posture, like someone who had learned not to lean too far forward. During the session, the therapist asked us to describe what safety would look like in our relationship. Elena answered first. She said she needed consistency, emotional availability, and honesty without defensiveness. She explained that she didn't want promises made under pressure. She wanted changes that would remain even when things felt stable again. When it was my turn, I admitted that I had equated love with responsibility. I believed working harder and earning more was proof of commitment. I realized now that emotional neglect can exist even when intentions are good. I acknowledged that I often responded to her concerns with logic instead of empathy. I had tried to solve feelings rather than understand them. Elena listened without interrupting. That alone felt different from our conversations months earlier, when we would speak over each other. The therapist pointed out that we were finally taking turns, which meant we were practicing respect in real time. After the session, we sat outside on a bench near the office. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden embrace, just quiet conversation. I asked her directly whether she saw any path forward. She paused before answering. She said she could see effort, but effort needed time to become trust. She wasn't ready to move back in. She wasn't ready to declare the marriage repaired, but she was willing to continue counseling and observe whether my changes were sustainable. That was not the answer I hoped for, yet it was honest. In the following weeks, I kept my commitments without exception. I reduced overtime permanently. I scheduled weekly check-ins with her. We agreed to spend one evening together each week without phones or distractions. At first, those evenings felt structured, almost formal. Over time, they became more natural. We talked about everyday topics, but also about fears and expectations. For the first time in years, I listened without preparing a rebuttal. When she shared something vulnerable, I didn't immediately respond with solutions. I asked follow-up questions instead. That shift changed the tone between us. One evening, she admitted she had considered finalizing a separation during the period she was staying with her sister. She said she had emotionally detached to protect herself from further disappointment. Hearing that was painful, but I appreciated her transparency. I told her that I understood why she needed distance. I didn't argue against her past decisions. Instead, I focused on demonstrating reliability in the present. Gradually, the atmosphere between us softened. Not because the past disappeared, but because consistency began replacing uncertainty. She still maintained boundaries. We did not rush physical closeness. We did not pretend everything was resolved. Instead, we rebuilt communication step by step. There were setbacks. On particularly stressful workdays, I felt the old instinct to overwork returning. When that happened, I reminded myself that balance was now essential. Elena noticed the difference when I honored our agreed time together. She acknowledged it, which reinforced the effort. During one counseling session, the therapist asked whether either of us felt safer than before. Elena said she felt cautiously hopeful. I said I felt more aware of my responsibility in maintaining connection. Neither of us claimed full restoration, but both of us recognized progress. I learned that trying to fix a relationship too late does not mean improvement is impossible. It means the repair must be intentional and sustained. It requires accepting that forgiveness does not erase consequences instantly. By the end of that month, Elena told me she was not ready to declare a decision about the future, but she no longer felt certain that the relationship was beyond repair. That statement felt like a bridge, not a destination. For the first time since she left, I felt that my actions aligned with my words. Whether we ultimately remained married would depend on continued effort from both of us. But I understood something clearly. If I had maintained this level of attention earlier, we might not have reached separation. I tried to fix our relationship when I realized it was failing. Now I was learning how to maintain it so it wouldn't fail again. I began to understand that rebuilding something damaged is slower than destroying it in the first place. After Elena said she felt cautiously hopeful, I expected relief to feel immediate. Instead, I felt responsibility. Hope was no longer passive. It required maintenance. Every day mattered. We continued counseling. Each session uncovered another layer of misunderstanding. Not dramatic secrets, but accumulated habits. I learned how often I had dismissed emotional conversations because they didn't seem urgent. Elena admitted she had avoided escalating issues because she feared conflict would push me further into work. The therapist encouraged us to practice structured communication at home. We set aside one evening per week for an honest check-in. During those conversations, we discussed not only problems, but also appreciation. At first, it felt forced. Over time, it felt necessary. One night, Elena told me she noticed I was more present. She said I asked questions differently now. Instead of asking how to fix something, I asked how she felt about it. That distinction seemed small, but it changed the tone between us. I started sharing details about my work stress without framing them as excuses. I explained deadlines, but I also explained how they affected my mood. She responded by sharing her creative challenges more openly. We were no longer protecting each other from reality. We were including each other in it. Despite progress, she maintained her boundaries. We still lived separately. She had not moved back into the apartment. She said she needed evidence over time, not temporary improvement. I respected that decision, even when it felt uncomfortable. There were moments of doubt. On particularly exhausting days, I worried that she might decide the effort wasn't enough. I couldn't control her conclusion. The only thing within my control was consistency. One evening, after a counseling session, she asked me a direct question. If she never returned to living together, would I still maintain these changes? The question forced me to reflect honestly. I realized the transformation had to exist independently of the outcome. If I only improved to win her back, the foundation would remain unstable. I told her that regardless of what happened, I didn't want to return to the version of myself that had ignored connection. She studied my face carefully, as if measuring sincerity. Then she said she believed I was changing for the right reasons, but she still needed time to feel secure. That honesty felt more valuable than premature reassurance. Weeks passed. Our interactions became calmer. We discussed practical matters without tension. We also began sharing memories, not to relive the past, but to understand how we had evolved. Some conversations were emotional. Others were ordinary. Both mattered. I noticed something important. I no longer felt the urge to defend myself when she expressed concerns. That instinct had faded. Instead of interpreting feedback as criticism, I treated it as information. During one session, the therapist asked whether we could imagine a future together without fear. Elena hesitated, then said she could imagine it, but only if the changes remained consistent. I said I was prepared to commit to that consistency long term. The idea of reconciliation no longer felt like a dramatic rescue. It felt like gradual reconstruction. At home, I adjusted routines permanently. I limited overtime to specific days. I created dedicated time for shared activities. I removed distractions during conversations. These were not temporary gestures. They became structural changes in my life. Elena responded by gradually increasing the time we spent together outside therapy. We went for walks, cooked simple meals, and discussed plans without pressure. Trust did not return suddenly, but it began appearing in small actions. One afternoon, she told me she felt less alone than she had before leaving. That statement meant more than any declaration of love would have at that stage. It confirmed that progress was real. Still, she did not rush back into the apartment. She wanted to be certain that stability would continue beyond the initial crisis. I understood that rebuilding requires patience from both sides. I stopped asking when she would move back. Instead, I focused on becoming reliable in every interaction. I realized that relationships don't fail because of one mistake. They fail because patterns go uncorrected. Now, the pattern was changing. For the first time in a long while, our future felt uncertain in a healthy way, not a fearful one. We were no longer drifting. We were actively deciding. I had tried to fix our relationship after it was already breaking. Now I was learning that true repair depends on daily effort, not emergency reactions. Whether we ultimately reunite fully will depend on continued growth. But for the first time since she left, I no longer feel powerless. I stopped measuring progress in dramatic moments and started measuring it in consistency. By the fourth month after Elena moved out, our conversations no longer felt like negotiations. They felt like rebuilding. We had settled into a rhythm. Therapy once a week, personal reflection, and structured time together. There was no rush to define the relationship. That uncertainty used to terrify me, but now it felt honest. One evening, after a counseling session, the therapist asked us to describe how the relationship felt in one word. Elena chose steady. I chose responsible. The therapist smiled and said those words reflected growth. Outside the office, Elena admitted she never expected me to change this much. She said she had prepared herself emotionally to accept that our marriage might end. Hearing that reminded me how close we had come to permanent separation. The realization didn't create fear anymore. It created gratitude for the opportunity to try again. We continued seeing each other regularly, but slowly. No pressure to move back in. She wanted to feel secure before making any decision. I respected that completely. I no longer saw her boundaries as rejection. I saw them as protection. During this period, I noticed something important about myself. The urge to prioritize work above everything had softened. I still cared about my career, but it no longer defined my identity. When deadlines approached, I planned carefully instead of automatically extending hours. Balance required discipline, not emotion. One night, while reviewing my schedule, I realized how much time I had regained for connection. Instead of late evenings at the office, I had structured evenings free for meaningful interaction. The change felt sustainable, not temporary. Elena invited me to attend a small exhibition at her studio. It was not framed as a date, just an event. I arrived early and watched her interact with visitors. She was confident, engaged, passionate. Seeing her in that environment reminded me why I had admired her from the beginning. Her independence was not a threat. It was part of who she was. After the exhibition, we talked privately. She told me she felt calmer than she had in years. Not because all problems were solved, but because she no longer felt invisible. That statement was powerful. It meant the core wound was healing. However, she still hadn't decided whether to move back in permanently. She said she needed to see continued stability over time. I understood that trust cannot be rebuilt with short bursts of effort. It requires repetition. I never asked her to hurry. Instead, I focused on maintaining transparency. I shared my work calendar openly. I checked in about her schedule. We coordinated plans together. Communication became proactive rather than reactive. During one counseling session, the therapist asked whether either of us felt pressure to decide the future. The first time Elena mentioned moving back in, she didn't say it dramatically. She brought it up during an ordinary conversation about groceries. We were standing in the kitchen at her sister's place, preparing dinner together. The routine felt natural now. No tension, no performance. She looked at the counter while chopping vegetables and said, "I've been thinking about something." My heart didn't race this time. I stayed calm. She explained that over the past months, she felt consistently respected and heard. The therapy sessions had helped clarify expectations. My schedule was balanced. Our communication was structured but genuine. She said the environment between us no longer felt emotionally unsafe. Then she paused. "I think I'm ready to consider living together again," she said. The sentence landed quietly, but deeply. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to celebrate. Instead, I asked how she envisioned that step. She said she wanted it to be gradual. Not a sudden move, but a planned transition. She wanted reassurance that the improvements were stable, not situational. I agreed immediately. There was no hesitation. The old version of me might have focused on timelines. The current version understood pacing. We decided to begin with shared weekends in the apartment. Not full relocation, just testing routine. It felt practical, not romantic. And that practicality made it stronger. The first weekend was calm. We cooked together in our kitchen. The space felt different because we were different. I noticed details I had ignored before. The way she organized ingredients, how she played music softly while working, how naturally she moved around the room. Instead of seeing habits as background noise, I appreciated them. We discussed expectations openly. Household responsibilities were divided clearly. Work schedules were shared in advance. We created simple rules: no phones during meals, weekly check-ins, and honest communication about stress levels. Nothing felt forced. It felt collaborative. Still, I knew trust required time beyond comfort. So I remained consistent without drawing attention to it. I didn't remind her of my progress. I demonstrated it quietly. One evening, she brought up the past directly. She said she wanted to understand what had changed internally, not just externally. That question mattered. I explained that therapy helped me recognize avoidance patterns. When overwhelmed, I used work as escape. It felt productive, but it was emotional distance disguised as responsibility. I admitted that I had feared slowing down because I tied identity to achievement. She listened carefully. I told her I no longer viewed love as something maintained automatically. It required intentional presence. I had learned that lesson too late for comfort, but hopefully not too late for repair. She nodded, and said she could see the difference in how I handled conversations. Before, I would defend quickly. Now, I paused and reflected. That observation meant more than praise. As months continued, our shared weekends became more frequent. Eventually, Elena decided to return permanently. The move was calm, organized, and without drama. There were no grand speeches, just coordinated logistics and mutual agreement. The day she brought her final boxes back, we unpacked together. It felt symbolic, but not theatrical. We discussed where each item belonged. The process reinforced cooperation. However, we didn't declare the marriage fixed. Instead, we acknowledged it was evolving. In counseling, we shifted focus from crisis repair to maintenance strategies. The therapist emphasized sustainability. We practiced conflict resolution techniques and learned how to express needs before frustration escalated. One evening, we had our first minor disagreement since reconciliation. It was about scheduling. In the past, such a disagreement might have grown into resentment. This time, we handled it within the same day. We discussed, adjusted, and moved forward. That moment confirmed something important. Growth was holding under pressure. Elena later told me she felt safer expressing dissatisfaction now because she trusted I wouldn't dismiss it. That trust was the foundation we had lacked before. Looking back, I understood how close we had come to permanent separation. If she had decided differently during the months apart, I would have accepted it. The responsibility was mine. But trying to fix things after realizing the damage had given us a second chance. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't effortless. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt confident that our relationship was no longer surviving out of habit. It was being rebuilt deliberately. The real ending of our crisis didn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happened quietly, in the middle of an ordinary evening. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, talking about nothing important. At some point, I realized I wasn't anxious anymore. Not about losing her, not about saying the wrong thing, not about whether she would leave again. The fear that had controlled me during the separation was gone. Elena leaned against me naturally, without hesitation. That simple physical closeness meant more than any promise. It wasn't forced. It wasn't requested. It just happened. She told me she felt stable now. Not because life was perfect, but because she trusted the pattern we had built. Consistent communication, shared planning, emotional transparency. Those habits replaced the silence that once dominated our home. I asked her directly if she regretted giving us another chance. She thought for a moment and said no. She said the separation had been painful, but necessary. Without it, she might have continued feeling invisible. And without it, I might have continued believing effort at work was enough. We both understood that the distance forced honesty. It stripped away assumptions and replaced them with clarity. Over time, our relationship stopped feeling like a project under repair and started feeling like a partnership in motion. We still attended occasional counseling sessions, but they became maintenance rather than emergency support. We used what we learned instead of reacting emotionally. One evening, several months after she moved back in, she surprised me by saying something that stayed with me. I don't feel alone anymore. That sentence carried the weight of everything we had gone through. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. It was simple and real. Hearing it confirmed that the changes had worked. I realized then that trying to fix our relationship when it was already breaking had felt like desperation. But the real transformation came from accepting responsibility, adjusting permanently, and understanding that love requires daily attention. If I had ignored her concerns again, if I had returned to old habits once the crisis settled, we would have ended up right back where we started. That thought keeps me grounded. Now, when stress builds, I communicate instead of withdrawing. When she expresses discomfort, I listen before responding. We no longer assume the other person can read minds. We speak clearly, even when it feels uncomfortable. The separation almost became permanent. There were moments when she was ready to let go completely. I remember that truth. It reminds me not to take stability for granted. Looking back, I understand something important. Sometimes you don't realize the depth of emotional distance until the other person is already halfway out the door. By the time I tried to fix everything, it felt too late. But it wasn't. It was just the beginning of doing things correctly. We rebuilt slowly, intentionally, and with accountability. The relationship we have now is stronger because it survived honesty. It survived space. It survived fear. I tried to fix our relationship when I realized it was falling apart. And although I was late, I wasn't too late to change. That difference saved us. Even after Elena moved back in permanently, I didn't allow myself to relax completely. I had learned that comfort can quietly turn into neglect if you stop paying attention. Our apartment felt different with both of us inside it again. Not because of decorations or furniture, but because of awareness. We were more intentional about everything. Conversations were deliberate. Time together was scheduled and protected. It didn't feel restrictive, it felt respectful. The first few weeks were focused on rebuilding routine. We kept the weekly therapy sessions. We continued structured check-ins at home. But gradually, those conversations became less about repair and more about everyday life. One evening, Elena asked me something unexpected. She wanted to know what I feared most now. I thought carefully before answering. I admitted that my biggest fear wasn't losing my job or facing professional setbacks. It was returning to emotional distance without realizing it. I told her I was afraid of becoming comfortable again and slowly drifting into old habits. She appreciated the honesty. She said that awareness was the reason she felt safer. She explained that before, I had not recognized the problem. Now I recognized it early. That difference gave her confidence. We also discussed long-term expectations. We talked about family plans, career ambitions, and where we wanted to live in the future. These discussions used to feel overwhelming. Now they felt constructive. We weren't arguing about priorities. We were aligning them. One challenge we faced was rebuilding intimacy. Not just physical closeness, but emotional openness. During the separation period, trust had weakened. Even though we were improving, vulnerability still required effort. Instead of rushing, we approached it gradually. We spent time talking about personal insecurities. I shared moments from my childhood that shaped my tendency to overwork. Elena shared her fear of feeling secondary to someone's career. Understanding those foundations helped us avoid repeating patterns. There were still difficult days. Stress at work sometimes tested my balance. On one particularly intense week, deadlines stacked up unexpectedly. In the past, I would have extended my hours without discussion. This time, I informed Elena in advance. We adjusted plans together. That transparency prevented resentment. She later told me that communication before decisions made her feel included. Inclusion replaced suspicion. The most significant change, however, was emotional responsiveness. When she expressed frustration, I no longer reacted defensively. I listened first. When I felt overwhelmed, I communicated instead of withdrawing. That mutual openness strengthened our connection more than any grand gesture could. After several months of living together again, the therapist suggested gradually reducing session frequency. Not because we were finished, but because we were stabilizing. We agreed to continue monthly check-ins instead of weekly ones. That transition marked another milestone. It meant we were no longer operating in recovery mode. We were functioning as a healthier couple. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, Elena reflected on the entire journey. She said that although the separation was painful, it forced honesty. Without that crisis, she might have continued feeling unseen indefinitely. I admitted that I might have continued overworking indefinitely as well. The separation had been the wake-up call neither of us wanted, but both of us needed. She told me she was proud of the progress we had made. Hearing that meant more than I expected, not because it validated me, but because it confirmed her happiness was returning. For the first time in a long while, I felt confident not because the relationship was safe from problems, but because we now had tools to handle them. We weren't perfect. We still had disagreements. But we approached them with respect and clarity. The emotional distance that once defined us no longer existed. I realized that when I tried to fix our relationship too late, it wasn't the end of the story. It became the beginning of a different version of it. One built on awareness instead of assumption. The crisis had nearly ended us. Instead, it reshaped us. And for the first time since everything started falling apart, I no longer felt like I was trying to repair something broken. I felt like we were maintaining something strong.